Hi, welcome to our conversation on lawyers in public policy positions in the nonprofit sector. My name is Titi Leo, and I'm with the Levin Center for Public Service and Public Interest. We're excited to have all of you joining us, both students and alumni today, to hear from several of our alumni and also a wonderful guest who's working on terrific issues with respect to state courts, who's not an alum. And I wanted, as we get started, to especially thank the Center on Legal Professions and the Law School's Department of Alumni Relations for partnering with us on this project, as well as, of course, the Law and Policy Lab. We'll hear more from them in a minute. For the students that are on this webinar, I want to remind you of some upcoming events that we're having this week, also to help you with your career development goals. So on Thursday, we have a panel on private public interest law firms on Zoom at 1 p.m. during lunchtime. At 3 p.m., we're going to have a in-person send-off and an opportunity to hear perspectives from Professor Beth Van Skak, who was recently appointed by President Joe Biden to be our new ambassador at large for global criminal justice. So that's Thursday, 3 p.m. in Manning Lounge. And on Friday at 1 p.m., we're going to be hearing from Linda Barrera, who is on the California Energy Commission, and that will be via Zoom at 1 p.m. I'm going to hand off to Lucy Herman, who's the director of the Law and Policy Lab here at Stanford Law School.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to have everyone here to hear about policy careers. This has been a long time coming. I'll let Professor Brest tell you a bit more about that in a moment. I just wanted to say I'm the program director for the Law and Policy Lab. Professor Brest is the faculty director, and together we've been building up an initiative around public policy where this career series will fit now. And there's another one coming up in January. So I'm putting a link into the chat. If you're interested in tracking our career series, you'll be seeing more posters and advertising there. So get ready for Tuesday, January 25th, when we will be talking with government agencies. For now, I'm passing it to Professor Paul Brest, who literally needs no introduction in this community. He is our beloved former dean, who is incredibly active in hosting so many more of these kinds of initiatives. I pass it to you, Professor Brest, to tell people a little bit more about this initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I don't know if I don't need an introduction, but I'm not going to take one anyway. So just you know, law school prepares its students to be in positions of public policy as well as law, and including, work on legislative committees, in legislatures themselves, administrative agencies and the like. And an increasing number of our students go to law school, I think, thinking that in addition to, or perhaps even instead of practicing law, they are going to have public policy roles. And the school has, over the last several years, been increasingly mindful of this and asked how we could better prepare our students for roles in public policy. And, as anybody who's been at this law school or others for that matter knows, even courses that don't have policy in their title, beginning with torts and criminal law and constitutional law in the first year, have huge policy components. And that's true of many advanced courses as well. What we've been trying to do as we understand the kinds of skills and knowledge that our graduates need who are going to be playing policy roles, what we've been trying to do is begin designing courses explicitly for that, to help students prepare for those roles. And with the help of a number of students, Lucy and I have put together a guidance for students who are taking the current curriculum at the same time as we're trying to design a handful of new courses, including courses on learning from evidence, focusing a lot on causal inference, but other issues, on issues of equality and diversity, and on political institutions. So this is a work in progress, but even while the work in progress is in progress, there are many courses at the law school that that students can take to prepare for policy, as well as for roles in public interest lawyering. And with that little introduction, I turn it over to Diane.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome, everyone. My name's Diane Chin. I'm the Associate Dean for Public Service and Public Interest Law here at the law school. And I've been delighted to partner with Paul and Lucy and many others as they've been developing this terrific new program. I'm also really excited to introduce you to a really inspiring and impressive group of law graduates who are making impact in their communities and our country by using their legal training and skills within the policy realm. So we will explore with them the types of work they do, the skills they use, and also learn more about the paths they each have taken. And let me just briefly introduce all of the panelists at once, and then we'll get into our conversation. So Cesar de la Vega is a 2014 graduate of the law school. I remember him fondly as a student, and I'm so delighted to have him back. He's currently a senior policy analyst at Change Lab Solutions in Oakland, California, where he focuses on education policy and health justice, healthy housing and neighborhoods, community engagement and capacity building, and advancing innovative laws and policies to promote health equity in communities across the country. Jacqueline De Leon is a JD 2011 from Stanford and an enrolled member of the Isla de Pueblo. As a staff attorney at NARF, she has helped lead field hearings across Indian country on Native American voting rights, co-authoring reports documenting obstacles to the political participation of Native American voters, and on multiple occasions has testified before Congress detailing voting rights issues in Indian country. She also serves as the chair of the advisory committee of the American Bar Association's bipartisan standing committee on election law. Danielle Hirsch is a principal court management consultant at the National Center for State Courts, and where she primarily focuses on access to justice and business process simplification in civil courts. Danielle is the lead staff for the Conference of Chief Justices, Conference of State Court Administrators, Access and Fairness Committee, its post-pandemic planning technology working group, and the Blueprint for Racial Justice to Increase Diversity of the Bench, Bar, and Workforce Working Group. So thank you for joining us. And finally, Amy Matsui is a 1999 graduate of the law school, and she directs the Income Security and directs the Income Security Project and is senior counsel at the National Women's Law Center, where she's worked since 2002. She works on a broad range of economic issues affecting low and moderate income women and families, with special emphasis on federal and state tax policy, which I love the fact that you work on tax policy. Her work comprises policy analysis, state and federal advocacy, and public education and outreach as well. So to start us off, I thought it would be most interesting just to lay the groundwork and to help show our audience the paths that each of you pursued into public policy work from law school. And I wonder if we could just start with Danielle, and if you could just tell us a little bit about the path that you chose.
Thank you all for having me, and a special thank you to Lucy for inviting me. It's a great honor to be part of this program, and as the one non-Stanford student, I applaud all of you for your interest in policy, and it's a treat to be here. I have been at the National Center for State Courts for a little over 2 years, and before that I worked for the Illinois courts, and I have clerked for a number of judges and worked at a large international law firm, and then worked for a foundation. And I think I always knew, I went to law school because I liked policy work, and I kind of pinched myself with the luck that I ended up where I am. So I do policy work with state courts, which is where 98% of litigation happens across the country. And it affects real people's lives, whether it's wage theft, housing, domestic violence, mortgage foreclosure, et cetera. And so to get to have an opportunity to influence policy in that space has been incredibly rewarding, and happy to talk about it more.
Thanks, Danielle. Caesar, do you want to talk a little bit about your path to Change Lab Solutions?
Sure, of course, happy to do so. Thank you all for having me. So my path into policy work actually started during law school. I did summer placements at community-based organizations that blended law and policy work. So I did work around education and health policy. I also took a class in law school on medical legal partnerships that was jointly offered by the law school, medical school, and policy program. And then in my 3L year, I participated in what I think was the first year of the Law and Policy Lab. I was involved in a course with Professor Brest and Professor Deborah Rohde on obesity in Santa Clara County. And these experiences combined really solidified my desire to focus on policy work rather than doing some litigation work, which for me personally felt a little too adversarial, and I wanted to work in a space where I thought folks were working collaboratively. So I had a fellowship post-law school at the Urban Institute, a research organization in Washington, D.C. And although I was working in-house there, focused on things like data governance and cybersecurity, I found myself constantly, again, being pulled into the world of researchers and policy experts, and found myself just sort of having conversations with those folks. And that experience sort of confirmed for me that I was most moved by policy work. So post the Urban Institute, I went back home to Los Angeles and worked at the City Project with Robert Garcia, and have been on that path since then. I was exposed to issues of civil rights and health justice, working on issues of equity and racial justice. And from the City Project, I was able to land a legal fellowship at Change Lab, but knew I was interested in transitioning into the policy world, and knew that Change Lab had on staff policy analysts, public health practitioners, and that felt like an easy way to make the transition. And thankfully it worked out, and I've been with Change Lab now for a little over 4 years. So happy to share more about the journey along the way, but that's a high level overview.
Great, thank you, Caesar. And Jacqueline, what about you? How did you end up at NARF?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. So good to see you, Diane, and so good to be here sharing with you all. I think my goal was always to work, with Native Americans, and sort of, and honestly, I had my eyes on NARF for a long time as the organization that, sort of does most of the forefront of legal work, nonprofit legal work in Indian country. And so, to get there, I clerked a couple of times, and then I worked at a large firm. And then, I think we were looking at NARF, and a job, eventually came available, and we ended up moving to Colorado, and then I ended up working at NARF. While I was at NARF, I was fortunate enough that a voting rights project came up. And so I was assigned initially just to this voting rights project, and that has consumed in the best of ways my life for the last 5 years. So, I think I started with field hearings, which is, going directly to Indian country, and we held a series of them asking, what's keeping you from voting? So sort of actually getting really deep into the obstacles themselves, which then ended up lending itself to policy down the road. But in that time, it was a unique opportunity to sort of build this in-depth report. At the same time, I was litigating some voting rights cases, and I continue to have a pretty active voting rights docket. And then, I moved on after the field hearings to taking over some of our Hill work. So have been, talking a lot with voting rights advocates and the Hill about not just the obstacles that Native Americans face, but the importance of the Voting Rights Act. So pushing for policy in the Voting Rights Act and for the Native American Voting Rights Act, and working closely with Senator Lujan's office that introduced the Native American Voting Rights Act on updating language over the course of this year based on this past election. So I kind of do a combination of things, but public policy is certainly a part of the mix and informed greatly by all the other pieces that I've got going on.
Great, thanks. And Amy, what about you? Tell us your story and your path to public policy work.
Thanks so much, Diane. And I'm really excited to be with all of you here today, and especially to be on this tremendous panel with my fellow alumni. So I'm going to start a little bit and talk about what I did before law school, which was teach in public schools. And I think that part of why I went to law school was the experience of working with kids and their families, both in kind of urban locations and rural, and just kind of seeing for families with children, especially for single moms who are raising children on their own, why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult to get families what they need to make ends meet? When families need a boost, when they've fallen on hard times, why is it so challenging and so difficult for people to get what they need to meet the basics? When I was at Stanford, I was fortunate to have a couple of experiences that kind of furthered that question in my mind. So I got to work at the East Palo Alto Clinic. I benefited from classes with Pam Carlin. When I went to law school was very soon after the 1996 reform, when aid for families with dependent children became temporary assistance for needy families, and seeing the changes that enacted and made on people's lives in California was one of the things that I got to take a look at while I was at Stanford. And particularly what I got to the chance to ask people about was how were women able to get childcare, how difficult or how easy was that for them to do when they suddenly had these expectations of having to go to work, having benefits cut off after a particular amount of time, and having restrictions on the kinds of things they could be spending their time on, whether that was education or work-related activities. So despite kind of all these rich and exciting experiences that I was able to have at law school, where I went right after school was into a firm. So I did a couple years in private practice and also clerked for a judge on the Fifth Circuit. Serendipitously, I moved to DC for what I thought was a year in 2001 and landed at the Law Center, kind of fell in love with the work that I was doing and have been here ever since. To Diane's point, when I started at the Law Center, the first thing I was working on was ERISA and a retirement security for women and pension benefits. And that kind of expanded to do more tax work around refundable tax credits like the child tax credit, which is very much in the news these days, and the earned income tax credit, because they make such a difference in families' lives. And from there, we've kind of expanded our tax work with the kind of the generous intellectual support of the critical race and gender theory around tax to think about making tax policy more of a feminist issue, and having kind of the women's community looking at tax, not just for the revenues that can bring in, which is part of the current conversation again right now, but also what is baked into the tax code and what does that reflect about the assumptions of people who wrote it, for the kinds of work that's paid for and supported by the tax code, and really what are the things that are baked into it in terms of racial and gender equity. So my work has evolved in policy, but it encompasses both really nitty-gritty work around legislative advocacy, drafting, looking at draft legislation. Over a period of 4 years, we did a lot of administrative advocacy, kind of laying the record for on different comments on different proposed rules and why they would impact women and families, with a tiny little bit of litigation sprinkled in. So I'll stop there, but that's a lot of what my practice looks like right now.
Great, thanks everybody. So just for the audience, we've heard some very different and interesting stories, both in terms of pathways, but also in terms of the substance of the work that our panelists are engaged in. Litigation, I think, will always be an important option and strategy to advance social justice and to promote change. And what you've heard described is the ways in which systems can be engaged differently. They can be designed. They can be created through legislation. They can be created through community engagement that creates other opportunities for different systems and structure design. And I'd like to probe with the panel a little bit more about what you think the legal skills, so the legal training, the legal experience that you got as you were pursuing your law degree. What are the skills and training that you received that you think has been the most helpful to your success in the policy realm? And maybe I'll start with Jacqueline and kind of go the opposite way on my screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to law school. I think certainly, just whatever the strictest analytic approaches, when you're thinking, even just con law, it's helpful to think, deeply about issues and then use that analytic framework when you're trying to solve problems. Because I think policy making is really about solving problems. The canvas is a lot broader, than litigation. In policy, you just have an option of being able to come up with solutions and trying to implement them. So I think, that analytic framework is the part that I pull on the most. And I find myself working mostly with lawyers as well.
Okay, thanks. Danielle, what about your thoughts on the kind of lawyering skills that you lean into in the policy realm now?
Well, a big part of my work is thinking about how to make courts more accessible to people who don't have lawyers, because most state court proceedings have at least one party, on the civil side, have at least one party unrepresented. And so for me, civil procedure has been really critical to understand and, just how to make legal terminology less complicated. I guess legal writing actually, honestly, has probably been a hugely important skill, because trying to take legal jargon and make it understandable to people who don't have legal training, I think good legal writing instructors help you figure out how to use legal terminology when you need it, but also to write cleanly and easily to be understood. So I guess probably those two. And then I am, as I mentioned, not a Stanford alum, so I can't speak to Stanford specific classes, but I took an international human rights clinic, and just the process of brief writing for my clients and thinking about how to take kind of arcane international law principles and make them into easily understood practice has been enormously valuable in my current job.
Thanks, Danielle. And what about your thoughts, Amy, on this? What are the skills of a lawyer that have translated well for you in the policy realm?
So I think definitely the advocacy. I do feel like, whether you're in a courtroom or writing or making an argument for an office on the Hill, just kind of having the idea of being able to boil your argument down, adjusting it to your audience, and make the points kind of quickly and succinctly. So that, I think, has been training that I've carried with me. I think having a sense, as you were saying before, of like law as a system. So being able to kind of take a step back, and in addition to the provision, why is the provision there? How does it fit with other provisions? And then how is that expressed and further interpreted through regulation? So I think having a sense of what the body of law is and kind of what it all is supposed to speak to and how it's supposed to work together. I also think just kind of having a really broad grounding in different systems of law. So, I do kind of call on principles of administrative law when we're writing comments for federal regulations. All of the reasons, there's kind of under the Administrative Procedure Act and the court precedents that underlie that. We as an organization that's both policy and legal, we kind of feel compelled to put those pieces together in all of the work that we do. And then last but not least, just the idea of marshaling evidence for the arguments that you're making. We tend to draw not only on law and legal principles, but also on social science, on data, whether it's from tax or other government agencies to pull together, but to do the best we can to tell a story and have that be supported by the evidence. Those are all things that I use every day in my job.
Great, thanks, Amy. And Cesar, your thoughts on this question?
Sure, I'll definitely echo Amy's point about marshaling evidence. That's a big part of the work that I still do. But I also often think back to learnings from my time in the Organizations and Transactions Clinic with Professor Jay Mitchell and Michelle Sonu, as well as the class with you, Diane, around public interest lawyering. And, these weren't maybe classic lawyer skills, but things around practical problem solving, being client-centered and understanding the importance of relationships, honoring and uplifting the expertise and lived experience of community members that are most impacted by policy decisions, as well as writing in a way that translates complex legal concepts into materials that can be picked up and acted upon by local policymakers, as well as community residents. So it's a lot of different tools, I think, that are in service of demystifying the law and breaking down some of those traditional barriers to create more opportunities for folks and advocates to use the law as a tool for equal justice in their respective movements. And that applies across my work, whether we're talking about safe, stable, and affordable housing, or removing exclusionary school discipline practices from school settings. So definitely pulled a lot from my time in law school.
Thanks. And maybe Cesar, let's stay with you for this and I'll go back around. Let's get pretty concrete now, because I think especially for our students who are still enrolled in law school, there can be questions about what we mean when we are talking about policy work versus legal work. So if each of you could just give a brief, concrete example of a current project or a successful project that you've recently worked on, where policy has shifted or where systems have changed, I think that would be really useful to our audience. And Cesar, why don't we just stay with you?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, actually, I think spring 2019, a client came to us with some questions about sidewalk vending after the state of California passed SB 946, which decriminalized sidewalk vending and required cities to develop policies around the practice. So we built a relationship with the client and learned more, listened closely to understand them fully, and learned that they were interested in promoting healthy food vending via incentives. So we produced a short, clear, non-lawyer friendly memo that provided some legal analysis and also provided examples of policy language that could be used to promote healthy food vending via a sidewalk vendor ordinance. So this was into 2019, and about 2 months ago, we heard back from these folks and learned that the city passed an ordinance that included language around healthy food vending, which we believe is one of the first cities in the state to do so. And what's interesting about this is we weren't directly working with the client the entire time, but we provided some of that initial research and shared that memo. And now the hope is that the client and others in the community will continue to monitor the policy and make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences of the policy. So we don't always get to do that work directly with the client, but it's something we preach to the client when we're having those initial conversations around policy ideas. So that's a concrete recent example that comes to mind.
Great, thank you, Cesar. And Amy, what about you?
So I'm really hoping that some of the work we've done over the past couple of years is going to come to fruition, but I don't want to jinx that. So I'm going to talk about a smaller example in the past. So I mentioned that we work on tax credits, and especially tax credits that benefit women and families. One area of expertise, I work with folks who do childcare policy, and then we have kind of a niche expertise in tax incentives and tax benefits that help support families who need support with childcare expenses, because childcare is wildly expensive and hard for individual families to bear. We make the general argument as a policy matter that it should be a public investment and a public good. And then on the tax side, there are in the federal tax code and in the codes of over half the states, provisions that kind of reimburse families. Families can seek kind of partial reimbursement for childcare expenses that they paid to go to work, to look for work, or go to school throughout the year. And then when they file their tax return, they can claim a credit against their taxes based on their childcare expenses. So the federal credit, unfortunately, is not refundable. And that means that for families who earn, under like $25,000, they don't really get any benefit from it because they don't have any tax liability. And if the credit's not refundable, all it does is wipe away tax liability. You don't get anything back. So one of the things that we've done for many years is to look at state credits, and certainly to lift those up if they are providing a refund for families. We've done a report on the 50 state credits for 20-ish years. And when those kind of findings come out, we publicize them, we write blogs, we do press reports, and we will do things like, testify in particular states to talk about how their tax provision could be improved. So in Maryland, a couple of years ago, I testified before the Committee on Children and Families in the legislature and talked about specific ways that their child independent care tax credit could be improved, and got to work with a lawmaker who took that on, improved the credit, made it refundable, made it larger. And that's a way that families in Maryland got kind of a concrete difference and improvement in the support that they could get through the tax code to help them meet their childcare expenses. And so that for us was, a lot of work in the previous years, work kind of with the legislative body and having conversations with a particular lawmaker's office to be able to make that change that makes a difference and put dollars back in people's pockets.
Thanks, Amy. And Danielle, could you tell us about one of your policy projects?
Sure, I'm going to give you two, if that's all right. The first is eviction diversion. So at the start of the pandemic, as you know, many of you know, the CDC embarked on a moratorium of evictions. And there's an unprecedented amount of emergency rental assistance monies flowing through the states right now. But if the courts aren't cooperating, which is usually the place where all of this happens, there can be a real disconnect where someone will have applied for emergency rental assistance, but could ultimately still get evicted while they're waiting. And there had been long delays between application and hearing. And so we started to see, first in the state of Michigan, but in several places across the country, courts that were willing to take more of a holistic collaborative approach, either pre-filing or post-filing, to enable different stakeholders to intervene in a more holistic fashion. And so we at the National Center for State Courts, because we're the secretariat for the Conference of Chief Justices and Conference of State Court Administrators, we started to work with courts across the country who wanted to set up an eviction diversion program in their own state, but didn't know how. So we might help ghostwrite a rule or help them think through who the different partners that they needed to involve, whether that's civil legal aid, emergency rental assistance providers, which could be a whole bunch of different providers depending on where you are, mediation services, et cetera. And then we convened a bunch of different jurisdictions together to talk through issues. And then it became so much in demand that we made kind of a Cosmo quiz for courts that were interested in setting up diversion, where you answer a series of questions. And we built this kind of automated guided interview where it tells you like full, medium, or light diversion and what you need to do. 2,000 courts have used our tool. We've had calls with a number of them to help them support programs that they have since started. There are lots of courts that still need help, but it was our way to start. So that's example number one. Oh, and then it got the attention of the White House and the Department of Justice and Treasury. And so They then asked us to stand up a website, which is ncsc.org/eviction, which now has resources for the public as far as finding where they can potentially get legal help in their jurisdiction, as well as information like this goofy tool for courts. And then the second example is also pandemic based, but leaning into the kind of joy and weirdness of the pandemic. A colleague, Zach, and I have made these things called tiny chats. They're short form videos since the start of the pandemic that usually revolve around access to justice issues, and they're slightly whimsical. And so I have a costume closet now as a result of this goofy thing. But we did one a few months ago. We had heard courts struggling with legal information. And as a teeny example, the idea of service of process, that really complicates a lot of self-represented litigants, especially when someone doesn't live within your jurisdiction. How do I serve the other side? And so we made a short form video, a service process video using PowerPoint, and we just went back and forth on a script. And it's now on 15 court websites. It's translated into some commonly spoken languages, and it's on a bunch of summonses and other resources to help people know what they need to do. And hopefully it results in less issues related to service. So they can be kind of joyful and creative, or they can be more like writing a rule.
Great. Those are two great examples. Thank you. And Jacqueline, what about you?
Yeah. So one thing that sort of was rumored to be true for a long time is that it was just really difficult to vote by mail in Indian country. And so, part of the field hearings was investigating, what made it so difficult for people to vote. And we dug into what was going on with voting by mail, and we learned that most homes on Indian country aren't addressed, and therefore they don't get mail delivery. And therefore people rely on post office boxes to pick up and drop off mail, and post office boxes can be 50 miles away over a dirt road. And so of course, it's just real hard to vote by mail, right? All of those compounding factors. And we also learned that post office delivery coming out of Indian country is often delayed and subjected to really circuitous mail routes, meaning people, the mail goes, from a remote reservation to a larger city, and then pings back to the local jurisdiction. And so there's, all of this delay and more potential of lost mail to happen, in that circuitous route. And so once we knew that, we started sort of more definitively saying vote by mail is difficult, if not impossible, in Indian country. And we're able to sort of, really kind of talk about the systemic problems. And so that kind of caught the attention of Washington State, right? Washington State has a number of tribes and also has a number of votes entirely by mail. And so we worked with Washington State to develop a policy of allowing tribes to designate a building to pick up, drop off, and collect ballots. And they could also use that designated building as an address to register to vote. And so, we testified in front of Washington State, and they adopted this policy this past year, which has been effective in increasing the ability for Native Americans to vote by mail. And then we've since taken that policy and put it into the Native American Voting Rights Act, which has been attached to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So the hope is that NAVRA with the national policy will, take that proof of concept coming from Washington State to provide some practical solutions for Native Americans trying to access mail ballots.
Great, thank you. So you've all described really interesting processes through which you get information about the issues that you're pursuing. Some of it, rises up from direct client contact. Some of it is kind of your longstanding presence within a specific topic or sector. I am very curious about who comprises your team. Who are the non-lawyers among your teams? How do you interact with them? What differences do you see? And maybe if you're managing or supervising folks who have different skills and different degrees than a JD, what is that like for you? And maybe I'll start with Amy on this one.
So I'm lucky to work with, I have two great lawyers and a legal fellow on my team. And we get to work with our campaign staff and communication staff who don't have law degrees, as well as we have we have a great in-house research team. Similarly, they're public policy folks and don't have law degrees. So I think the thing which I find really exhilarating about working with them is that they constantly remind us about kind of something that Cesar was referring to, how to translate legal concepts in a way and support them and talk about them and talk about the impact on people's lives in a way that's accessible for people who don't have, 45 minutes to sit and read the footnotes. So that is something which is really rewarding. And it also, I think, just dramatically amplifies the impact that the kind of the legal analysis can have by making it available and helping people to understand it.
Great, thank you. And maybe let's just go to Cesar to see what you would have to add to that. I know that there are a lot of Change Lab Solutions staff who are not JDs.
Yeah, we at Change Lab, we're an interdisciplinary team. We have lawyers, planners, policy experts, public health practitioners, and other professionals. And I love working with non-lawyers. At the prior organization, we had to be an expert in all of the things, and that's no longer the case here at Change Lab Solutions. I can have a conversation with a colleague who is a planner to learn the ins and outs of zoning, or talk to a public health expert who can tell me about evaluation and how to ensure that a policy is in fact helping a community rather than creating more harm. So I love that aspect of the work. I will say that sometimes there can be a cultural divide that can create some challenges, but we're actively working through that. And what I mean by that is, lawyers at times may be very quick to dissect and point out the shortcomings or challenges around an innovative policy solution. And while that critical analysis is certainly needed, I think there's a time and place to have those conversations that that folks who are non-lawyers I think they're used to working in a different space that maybe is a little more collaborative and about ideation and thinking about solutions without maybe going right to the challenges. So it's an interesting opportunity to learn skills from other folks and sort of tone down the lawyer tendencies that I have at times to issue spot and do all those things.
Great. So maybe you learn a little patience along the way. What about you, Jacqueline?
So NARF is primarily lawyers. We're mostly lawyers, but I do work with quite a few legal fellows. So some are externs and year-round externs that help quite a bit. They are wonderful and very important with what we do. Excellent paralegal staff that also, help us get over the finish line, a lot of things. And then I think, our communication staff, we've recently really started to build them up. We've made a couple of hires there, and it has been tremendous, because I can write an explainer and they can be like, this isn't an explainer. This is actually very technical. And they can help me make it into something that's digestible. And that's been wonderful and something that, is actually can be usable to the general public. And so working with them has been a lot of fun this past year.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And Danielle, who's on your team?
So my team is primarily lawyers at the National Center, but a lot of court administrators aren't actually lawyers. They might have an MPA or some other background. And so, like everyone is steeped in courts, but I actually, if it's all right, Diane, kind of twist the question a little bit. One of the projects that I work on and that is called the Justice for All project, and it was a almost $4 million grant program that funded 14 states to do strategic planning, whether it was at the access to justice system level, the bar, a combination of people. and it's predicated on some research that Becky Sandefur did, that most unmet legal needs happen to people who don't take any action, and so they don't seek out the bar. They don't, because they may not know the problem is legal in nature, or they know it's legal in nature but don't know how to advance it, or they think it's hopeless. And so I think it points us to the need to engage with more allied professionals than we traditionally do. And so one thing that's been really gratifying in a lot of our projects is we've been trying to engage with public librarians, health, hospice workers, hospital social workers, and other kinds of community groups to better understand where people turn when they have problems that have a legal component or potentially a legal solution, and make sure they understand where the resources are and how we can be most helpful, where the pain points are. Because if we just ask the people in the system, then we miss a huge number of the people who actually need legal help and don't take it.
Thank you, Danielle. I think that was really helpful as an example. So we have a question that came in through the Q&A, and another that I was going to ask already, and maybe we'll stick with Danielle and go kind of in reverse order. But I think for a lot of folks who are interested in doing policy work, there's just a question about how to get there. And, you know, you each describe slightly different paths, but if you have very concrete advice about actions to take, volunteering, skills to develop, and also a member of the audience asks, how do you suggest framing our story from our legal experience and really the rest of our prior work experience to obtain a policy position? Would you suggest emphasizing certain skills, traits, etc.? And I'm wondering, Danielle, if you could start us off.
So for me, I mean, I think a part of this was being open to try a bunch of different things and some dumb luck that got me where I am. But I think for the state courts in particular, they are becoming much more sophisticated in how they staff. And I think there are amazing opportunities at state and local courts to do policy work. And with legal training, you can make such an enormous impact on the experience of the people who come to court, and there are courts everywhere. And so clerking is wonderful, and I did it twice and I'm a big believer in it, but also working for a court system could give you really on the ground practical experience that I think would allow you entree into at least the court policy work very easily and directly. And then, you know, like my organization, we are constantly looking for people to partner with and engage with. We also do, if you have user design experience of some kind, I think that's becoming increasingly valuable, or being able, you know, which your law school excels at, thinking about how to incorporate design in how you think about delivering legal services. And so I would imagine that the Center for the Legal Profession and also Margaret Hagan's work together with the design school would be an enormous resource for you. And so those would be kind of my initial off the top ideas.
Okay. Thanks, Danielle. Jacqueline, what advice would you have for somebody who wanted to transition into policy work?
So for me, my policy work has really been subject matter driven. So I think, you know, knowing an area really well lends itself to policy work. Like, you know, the solutions because you're in that area so deeply. And I think that if you can demonstrate, you know, through your prior legal experience that you've come to know a subject very deeply and well, that's going to translate into an attractive, you know, characteristic for a policy position. And so I think, you know, just finding something that you're passionate about and working in that field can translate pretty well into policy.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Caesar, what are your thoughts on this?
I'll start with a couple of the skills. So I think, you know, particularly in light of the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd in 2020, a lot of folks in my space in public health law and policy are grappling with issues of equity and racial justice. So there are a lot of folks who are trying to catch up right now. So if you as a law student have the opportunity to build up some of those skills around doing equitable analyses, understanding issues of racial justice, I think that goes a long way. And then as far as like the path and getting there, I think what really helped for me was not getting caught up in like the title of a position or a job opportunity, and really looking at the work that an organization is doing, looking for places that did have a mix of law and policy to allow for a smoother transition. I also found really helpful. And then just having conversations with folks who have transitioned from law into policy, I think also goes a long way to learn about their paths, to learn about the skills that they've found most helpful. I've had great mentors along the way who have helped me on that journey for myself.
Thanks, Caesar. And Amy, what sage advice would you give?
So I think one thing that I'd like to point out is that like a lot of the skills that lawyers have are useful in public policy. I think that I certainly don't want to suggest that lawyers kind of have a corner market on being able to do public policy. I think that there are so many ways to be a really strong policy advocate. But some of the experiences that you can have as a lawyer, even whether it's litigation or it's implementation. So for example, just kind of if you have the opportunity to work in an agency, if you have the opportunity to help people get benefits, if you have the opportunity to work in a legislative capacity, all of those things help inform policy, because when you're developing a policy, you both want to have the language to make it real, and you also want to have the language to make it work as well as possible to the design point that Danielle was raising, that it's as easy as possible for people to access in kind of a benefits context. So all of those experiences are, well within kind of the mainstream of legal experiences that you can get in law school or right afterwards. And they all, I think, lend themselves towards being a strong policy advocate. So I think just, I tend to tell, younger lawyers and law students that the things that you pick to do are unified around the theme of you want to do them, you're interested in them. And you're trying to think of ways to further that and maybe different angles of making that a reality. And so I think all of those things together make a strong argument for why you can be a policy advocate.
Thanks. And I got a separate email with a question, which is trying to grapple with just what the role of a nonprofit is, and how you kind of assess where to draw lines in terms of policy advocacy, and what also potentially the unique role is of nonprofit advocacy organizations within this space. Jacqueline and Amy have spoken a lot about sort of developed substantive area expertise because your organizations have been living in those spaces. But I think the questioner is asking specifically what about kind of the role of nonprofits within this universe of folks who engage in policy for reform work. And Amy, maybe we'll just stay with you and ask your thoughts on that and kind of go in reverse order again.
So I think just one thing to be clear on what does it mean to be a nonprofit? And so for my organization, we're a 501c3, which means that we don't engage in partisan politics, but we do engage in advocacy. So that can mean either, we can advocate in the courts, and we can also advocate in legislatures as long as we're not kind of engaged in electioneering or, campaign work. And we also have a limit on how much lobbying that we can do. And all of this gets reported to the IRS. So I think the point is that we advocate about the issue rather than a political party or, a particular candidate. And so I think it's understanding kind of what the role is and what we can bring to that. And part of what we bring to our advocacy is the subject matter expertise. So I hope that's helpful, and I'll turn it over to other folks.
Great, thanks. I think Paul Brest wanted to add a word here, actually.
I just wanted to add that essentially advocacy by nonprofits is not different in kind from advocacy by corporations or other lobbyists, except that nonprofits are constrained by the Internal Revenue Code and some state legislation in a way, but especially the Internal Revenue Code in a way that corporations aren't. But the basic strategy of figuring out who holds the levers of power and how you are going to influence them, I think, is not fundamentally different.
Thanks, Paul. Caesar, do you have any thoughts about the role of nonprofits within the advocacy space that you have seen that might be unique?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the point was made about lobbying, and we're very mindful of limitations around that. So a lot of what we do is, you know, we create model policies or we create toolkits and other types of resources on health issues, so that folks can take that and do the work themselves in their communities. So it's a lot of times it's about education and sharing information without taking a particular stance on a live policy issue area. That said, I do think you know, sometimes things like model policies, you know, those are things that you don't want to just pick up, pull and plug. You know, there's tailoring that needs to go into that. So we do work around that as well. We share a model policy, but then we have a conversation with a partner about, you know, what does that mean within the local context when you think about maybe state level preemption issues or other things like that. I think the nonprofit serves a unique role, but a critical one in advancing policy work.
Thanks, Caesar. And Danielle, do you have thoughts on this?
So the policy work that we do is usually a little bit different. It's usually it's in the court space primarily. And because every state and territory has their own unique constitution and high court, a big part of what we're doing is sharing best practices among courts or suggesting rule changes. But like Amy, we're a 501c3. And so we will, institutionally, we have a government relations office that engages with the Judiciary Committee and others to think about and with Department of Justice, ways that the federal court can collaborate better or support the efforts of the state courts. But again, just like Amy, it is not partisan in nature, and we don't support any particular candidates financially. It's policy positions related to courts generally.
Great. And maybe we could get a final comment from Jacqueline. I'm just realizing our time is running out. So do you have thoughts about the role of nonprofits in this kind of policy and advocacy work?
Yeah, I mean, I can keep it short. I think I echo what other people say. We're also a 501c3. We're very mindful of our lobbying limits, but we are allowed a certain amount of lobbying. And so, you know, when particular issues come up, like NAVRA, you know, we're all in on those particular issues. And I think that's, you know, an allotment that we have to be mindful of, but use when it's necessary. But otherwise, you know, we're issue focused, and I don't care if a Republican or a Democrat supports it. I just want it supported. And that's the way that we operate.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing such a rich set of information about both your backgrounds as well as the kind of important work that you're doing right now. As TT Liu and Lucy Herman indicated, this is the first of many programs that will be presented by the law school to introduce more kinds of work that students and our graduates can explore to shift into the policymaking realm and learn how to use your skills to have that broad impact that you can achieve. So thanks to the Law and Policy Lab, the Center on the Legal Profession, and to the program group for working to pull this all together. Thanks so much to our panelists. Please stay in touch, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.